Ayubowan, Vanakkam, Assalamu alaikum, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of AmCham Sri Lanka, it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you here this evening on behalf of EWMI, the East-West Management Institute out of New York. As you know, we have an interesting topic or an interesting subject for discussion this evening, and despite the challenges that this pandemic has impressed upon us, we're grateful for your presence. We're grateful to each and every one of you for taking the time and being with us this evening. That goes not only to all of you present here physically at this venue, but also everybody joining us from around the world, many regionally, USA, Canada, and across the world. Thank you to each and every person who's joining us on our live platform as well. We're live both on Facebook and via Zoom, where we have many more participants as well. As I said, it's an interesting conversation, it's an interesting topic, something that's very important given the current context. Of course, COVID-19 has disrupted our lives and our livelihoods as we know it. That said, the business environment and ease of doing business is something that is essential and fundamental, regardless of challenges that life may bring us, and maybe even more so important in the face of the current challenges, because businesses are forced to pivot, are forced to be agile in their business models rather, and how things change will depend greatly on how we as a nation are able to attract and maintain investment in this country. And of course, something like bribery and corruption is very much a fundamental part of the ease of doing business and where we stand as a nation. So without much further ado, let me introduce you to our wonderful panelists who will be speaking to us and sharing this research and this information with us this evening. We have, of course, let me get this, of course. I must remind you, as I mentioned, this is a hybrid event. So I do want to beg your pardon ahead of schedule, just in case something goes wrong. And that goes, of course, again to everybody who's watching us from around the world. Like I said, we're live on multiple platforms. I think it's the first time that we're trying to amalgamate the various technologies. It's a learning curve for us, and I do hope you will excuse us if we have a little bit of tech difficulties. Technology is always wonderful when it works, as I say, but when it decides to kind of trip you up, that also happens. So my apologies in advance. So of course, leading the conversation today will be Dr. Nishan Dimel, who is the Executive Director and Head of Research of Verite Research, the think tank that has conducted this survey and this research and is presenting these findings for us this evening. He's, of course, an economist with extensive academic, policy, and private sector experience. He has been a member of the Presidential Task Force on Health Sector Reform, Presidential Committee on Tobacco, Alcohol, and Dangerous Drug Regulation, and the National Steering Committee on Social Security. He has also served as the Executive Director of the International Center for Ethnic Studies and on the board of the Sri Lanka Foundation Institute, among others. Internationally, Nishan has held several governing, teaching, and research positions, including as lecturer in economics at the University of Oxford. His undergraduate degree in economics is from the Harvard University, and he earned his master's and doctoral degrees in economics at the University of Oxford, where he was a Chevening Scholar. Dr. Nishan Dimel, thank you for your presence this evening. We look forward to the insights that you have to share with us. Mercedes Fogarasi leads business development with RiWi's clients in the humanitarian space, developing creative solutions and applications of RiWi's innovative technology for government agencies, the United Nations, and various other foundations, INGOs, and of course, academic institutions. She advises on best practices related to data collection in hard-to-research environments, of course, such as ours, and in order to sort of ensure safe, secure, and meaningful data-based solutions. Joining Mercedes is also representing RiWi, Kate Dyer, who coordinates and implements the day-to-day operations of multi-country citizen engagement projects, and of course she's worked on multiple similar projects. Both Kate and Mercedes will be joining us from Canada. As I said, we're connecting a lot of things here, so they'll be joining us via Zoom and presenting on this screen before you. They'll be joining us in approximately 25 to 30 minutes from now. Last but of course not least, Indika Pereira, who is attorney at law by trade and of course program director for EWMI in Sri Lanka. Indika, over to you for the formal welcome.
Thank you, Rai. Distinguished guests who are joining us here with us locally with all the precautions and social distancing, and the others, my colleagues who are joining us from US, and our partners who are joining us from many other places in Sri Lanka. It's a great privilege and an honor for East West Management Institute to welcome you to today's meeting to present the findings of 2 public opinion polls on the state of corruption in Sri Lanka. And we, East West Management Institute, was in Sri Lanka for last 5 years, and our main goal was to build the capacity of the Commission to investigate allegations of bribery and corruption and support the work of the civil society in Sri Lanka as well in promoting transparency and to combat corruption. And some of our civil society partners are the Transparency International Sri Lanka Chapter, Free Media Movement, CAFE, Theatre Action Group Jaffna, Sarvodaya Fusion, Afriel Vaunia, CED, and Center for Policy Alternatives. And we especially would like to thank the SIABOC, as we call in our local colloquial terms, Bribery Commission, for the support and assistance given to us throughout in implementing our program. And we also wish to thank American Chamber of Commerce and its Executive Director, Roy Raymond, for all her support and assistance in this matter. And we also wish to thank our main funder in this project, US State Department and the United States Embassy in Colombo, Sri Lanka, for their interest and support throughout. EWMI also wishes to mention and let you all know that our approach in to bribery and corruption is slightly different than many of the other civil society institutions. Our goal was not to name and shame, but to highlight the facts and problems in the country. So rather than going into naming and shaming, but to develop data that would help guide the Bribery Commission and other policymakers to implement and creating policy issues to deal with these problems. And we, as the East West Management Institute, commissioned these 2 surveys with Verite Research. Soon you will be hearing Dr. Nishan speaking, and their approach was more traditional in getting the polling data, on getting more on how a person on the street looks at bribery and corruption and how it is perceived. And secondly, the RiWi Corp, whom you will be hearing after Nishan, will be joining us from Canada. Their approach is more on internet users and how internet users perceived bribery and corruption in Sri Lanka and how they saw the issues. And their presentations will be followed by a Q&A session, which will be moderated by AmCham. And both the reports, you will have them. I think probably you may already have received, are in printed form, and if you want to have a digital copy, that also can be done. And thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming, and with all the pandemic and all the other issues, and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Indika. Dr. Dimel, may I now invite you to do the honors for this evening?
So welcome everyone. Let me begin by thanking especially Rai Raymond and the American Chamber of Commerce, East West Management Institute, represented here by Indika Pereira, but I think online also by Mark, who's in Washington, D.C. And there are others who have joined me. I think there's Sachinta Fernando, who was the leader of the research team on this, who's sitting in front. So that when you have really tough questions, I'm going to simply put them to her in the research. There's Manik Fernando, not related, who's the CEO of Vanguard Survey, who conducted the survey on our behalf. And I think there are others here who are who have a lot of experience in combating corruption. So let me thank all the distinguished guests, the friends who are joining in person, and especially for you who've joined in person for taking the trouble to come, and everyone who's joining online. Welcome. Let me just begin, but we have 20 minutes, so I'm not going to try and tell you everything about the survey. And in fact, we are going to try and tell you a little bit about the survey that's beyond the report. You know, you have a report, you can read it, there's a lot to learn from it. I don't want to simply restate the report. What I'm talking to you now is going to be almost beyond the report and helps you structure your thinking and understanding and a sense of response to corruption in Sri Lanka. It's in two sections, really. We are talking about survey design. That's really the theoretical approach we took. And under reforming the public sector, I want to talk about a very important application and an approach that Sri Lanka can take in going forward in addressing corruption in the country. So to start on my first section, on our theoretical approach, how did we approach this problem of understanding corruption in Sri Lanka and designing a response for corruption in Sri Lanka? So we've of course done briefings for the Commission to Investigate Bribery and Corruption, CMB, as we call it. And a proper briefing, of course, takes several hours. This is not that briefing. This is more for all of you who are very interested as citizens, as policymakers, as thinkers, to guide you in thinking about how you can focus your sensibility, understanding, and energy in responding to corruption in Sri Lanka. In our theoretical approach, I think we started where many countries has arrived at. In saying how do you combat corruption in a country, and especially looking at a corruption commission like CMB. We know that the role of combating corruption is not simply one of investigation and prosecution. So there is a role to actually desensitize corruption through the threat of investigation, through the threat of prosecution. And we also know the limitations that CMB faces and the country faces in successfully proceeding down that path. We also know from internationally, from any country that has successfully combated corruption, that it is not simply the vertical institutions that hold officials and politicians and others accountable, or the horizontal institutions, but it is also public perception, public understanding, public tolerance, what we call the vertical tolerance or space that facilitates corruption. So really, this investigation was begun by the understanding that CMB may have a lot of the rules, laws, and some may need reforming to work as an investigative, prosecutorial body. But CMB also needed to develop the technology and the architecture to facilitate a changed public environment, a changed public tolerance, to understand public perception and to respond to it effectively in how it combated corruption. So those were really our guiding principles, that it is not simply, we are not looking at the prosecutorial ability of SEABOC, though there are some things to learn for that through the perceptions, but we are also looking at how SEABOC responds to changing the social climate and understanding on corruption. Just to understand, the brass tacks of our survey, that's the logo of Vanguard Survey and Verite Research that worked together to implement the survey. Sachi Fernando, of course, led the design of the survey. We had 2,217 respondents all over the country, and we engaged in what is called a stratified multi-stage random sampling method. So you get as much dispersion at the GN level all over the country, and we are sampling them in a random way. We had focus group discussions, and some people who participated in them are here, as well as key informants and a few of our key informants are here as well, to interpret some of the survey results and to understand them better. The approach in the design that Verite took was not simply asking people, do you think corruption is good or bad? Is this particular act right or wrong? Because there are many ways in which you can ask people questions to which you tend to get standard answers, right? Because what people really think doesn't necessarily come out in simple answers that we give in polling surveys, for instance. So let me just introduce you to our method of design. We looked through 4 psychometric approaches to eliciting perception. One was we wanted to elicit moral perception. So we asked people, how acceptable is this form of corruption? So we designed really cases that people could evaluate next to each other. And we then worked to get a psychometric evaluation and triangulate that psychometric evaluation. So you don't do just one type of perception. You do 3-4 types of perception, and you try to put them together and compare how people come out. So when we ask, how people ascribe acceptability, that's looking at their moral sensibility. Then we ask about, how angry did you get, that level of agitation. That is more emotional, right? So what you claim as moral sensibility needs to be triangulated with your emotional response. I may say sometimes something is very wrong, but if I don't have a strong emotional response, that helps me understand how you're positioned in this. Then we also ask them to kind of rationally evaluate the severity. So that's more the rational response. And the rational response is sometimes different from your moral and emotional response. So you see those differences come out. You may see it as morally wrong, but you have ways of rationalizing why it is okay to do it, or it's not a problem. Economists do that all the time. They talk about how corruption can make the public sector efficient. I'll talk more about that. And then we talked about the frequency of occurrence, which is really the experiential dimension of corruption. So we really triangulated the moral, the emotional, the rational, and the experiential. And that was the approach that we took to really making sense of the answers that people gave to how they saw corruption and the level of tolerance, the public space that existed in terms of combating corruption. So we went on a scale of 1 to 5 on each and evaluated them. Additionally, we also built typologies of corruption. So you can't ask people about what you feel about corruption. That question doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So you have to ask people something more concrete. What do you think of this type of corruption? You have to give them a story, a narrative, a situation, and ask them to evaluate, because everybody thinks corruption is wrong. You're going to get a pretty vanilla answer if you ask plain vanilla answers. If you just say, what is corruption, good or bad? That's not the way to do it. So we created 6 typologies, and each one had a polarized pair of questions. So we had 12 scenarios in all that we put to people. I'm not going to walk you through all of that, but just to say that the typologies were petty versus grand corruption. We gave different narratives for that. A parliamentarian being corrupt versus a minister, cabinet minister with a lot more power. A national politician, that is either versus a local bureaucrat, which is a different scenario. Then we also looked at not only who was, the level of corruption in terms of actor or event, but also the initiator. What happens? How do people see corruption initiated by them versus corruption initiated by somebody else? We looked at whether people understood the difference between a bribe and using influence. So bribe is you actually give money, but nepotism, using influence, doesn't require transaction of money, but can have the same outcome. Who initiates also isn't about the outcome, but actually how it is begun. We also look at how people thought about whether the outcome was good or bad. Is it outcome I deserve to get? So if a bureaucrat is stopping me from doing something, getting my driver's license, maybe I think I deserve it, versus getting an undeserved outcome. Maybe if I pay a bribe to avoid paying taxes, that's undeserved, right? So let me, in this first stage of demonstrating our theoretical approach, tell you a little bit about our results and how we saw them, and now map these, the typologies we had to the psychometrics we had. This presentation is only an example of how we analyzed and the types of interesting findings we had. It's not an exhaustive presentation, obviously. So our story for petty corruption was a shopkeeper who offers a tax collector, maybe a licensing authority or someone who you had to pay a fee to, a small amount of money to avoid paying that tax or that fee. Our grand corruption scenario was a businessman who offers a senior customs official a large amount of money in order to import goods without paying taxes. Now, it's interesting that in this petty corruption case, right, petty versus grand case, we had the level of unacceptability. Your moral evaluation was pretty much the same. So even though you see there's a difference there in the averages, statistically there was no difference. Once you take off the error terms on those averages, they were statistically, people saw as a moral evaluation, it was wrong to do this kind of thing. But when you looked at level of anger, your emotional reaction, when you looked at how you reasoned about it, then there were very, very strong statistically different distinctions. People were much more angry about the grand corruption. So, there's a concept in Indian or let's say Hindi moral literature called Matsya Nyaya. Okay, Matsya is the singular kind of Sanskrit word for fish. Nyaya is the framework. The concept of Matsya Nyaya is that you live in a world where big fish tend to eat up the little fish. And if you look at the South Asian moral construction and views, often we are more sympathetic or less upset about things that little people do to secure their situation. We are much more upset when those in power bend the rules to get what they want. Because the concept, and you know that left politics in Sri Lanka, Marxist politics, which is also popular in Sri Lanka, works on this basis that we must resist a world in which the big fish can swallow up the little fish. And you see that very well here. That grand corruption evokes a much higher level of anger and is seen as a much more severe problem in society in terms of the rational interpretation than what is seen as petty, that what we saw as petty corruption. So these are guidelines, right? So if you're in the perspective of Seerbock, it may be easy to catch a lot of petty corruption, and there are theories that say you must have intolerance to small acts of corruption. But perhaps what works socially or resonates socially is going after some of the big fish in that moral dimension. And catching big fish makes a much bigger difference and is far more socially, politically salient than catching small fish, as it were. And that seems already obvious to you, but it's fascinating how the data and the analysis brings that out, right? So here's another one. Public sector initiator versus private sector initiator. We asked the scenario was when a principal of a school asks a parent to give them a cash gift to ensure that their child gets admission into a leading school. The private citizen one, where the parent offers a gift to the principal, and that gift can be a little more blurred. It's not quite clear when parents offer a gift to the school whether that's a bribe or not, right? But it was initiated by the parent to get their children admitted into school. So here, the answers were a little bit different. They're all statistically different. People saw that the public official initiating corruption was morally more wrong. The parent was seen as a weaker figure who was desperate and concerned for the child, but the public official's action was more morally wrong. It evoked a greater anger, and it was seen as much rationally also as a much higher level of corruption. So this petty versus grand thing is quite important. Just look at what I've written on the bottom of the slide. It caused, amongst all 12 scenarios that we put to people, the petty corruption had the least amount of anger. Petty corruption was rationally considered the least corrupt of all the 12 scenarios. And it was also considered the most uncommon. People didn't see this as a real problem. Even experientially, people didn't think that petty corruption was what was really a problem for the country. But grand corruption was seen as very, very significant. So again, when we are looking at how we contest corruption, we may have to take into account that there's a lot more public sympathy for corruption that is initiated by the public than corruption that is initiated by an official. And that sympathy goes in the moral dimension, the emotional dimension, as well as the rational dimension, right? So here's a classic example of that. In the case that we put to people of a traffic offense, a private citizen driving without his or her license is stopped by a police officer and provides a cash gift to the officer in order to successfully complete her journey. So this was considered the most acceptable of all the 12 scenarios, okay? And the most common of the 12 scenarios. So, and that's an interesting thing to also look at, that sometimes frequency and experiential frequency can drive what we call normalization. So if it is not something that's seen as very offensive, very problematic, morally people don't have very strong views, then, and they see it very often, and of course it is initiated by the individual, then people can feel that this is more acceptable because your fine is, what you pay the policeman may be similar to paying a fine to the state, except it's more convenient and it's less trouble. Now, we also asked questions on political corruption, right? And what's very interesting is that political corruption by officials, and mostly by the police and also public officials, was seen as the fundamentally the most acute problem for corruption in the country. Police came out top, and I'll go into more details on that later. So an elected official takes funds allocated for ministry renovation to finance his parliamentary election. Okay, so political corruption here. That was the most unacceptable of the 12 scenarios. It caused the second most amount of anger of the 12 scenarios we gave, and it was rationally seen as the most corrupt. I think we wanted to share with you that particular finding, because often in Sri Lanka's political cycle, development agencies, other well-meaning actors take the view that people don't care too much about political corruption. It doesn't matter too much. This is not the issue. This is not the big issue for people. It's cost of living, that you need to solve people's problems of poverty or hunger or employment before you solve problems of corruption. This survey suggests that that's not true, that people have extremely severe emotional, rational, and moral reactions to corruption by politicians, right? It doesn't mean that they see a choice in the voting space about who they can vote for. So there may be a sense of hopelessness that says we don't have non-corrupt politicians. But if you think about our own electoral cycle, that the Mahinda Rajapaksa government that won the war in 2010 with so much celebration and public support, that so much of the other parties actually switched their support to Mahinda Rajapaksa after that. How did he lose it in 2015? How did he lose an election in 2015? Many people thought that, people voted for devolution, people voted for transitional justice, but actually our own analysis suggests that people voted against corruption. And that was really the sticking problem. There was a high perception of a very high level of unchecked corruption, and all the positives of the government were made second to the concern for fighting corruption. Now, the fact that that one most important thing that people voted for was not delivered, perhaps is the failure of the next 5 years, right? With what we call the bond scam, the UMP effectively adorned the stigma of corruption on itself in a way that made the UMP now not distinguishable in any other way. So the hope that corruption would be put to bed or fought adequately and properly was the one major hope of that 2015 election, and perhaps it is the one hope that had too little focus in terms of the engagement of developmental organizations and civil society that focused more on other activities and thought perhaps we don't talk too much about the problems of corruption. So in a sense, I think even today, you might think that there is a void because there is nobody really politically addressing or speaking to citizens about their concern for corruption, while our own survey suggests that this is something that is very high in the interests that people have. Okay. So let me get on to another application section. So I think we should be very clear that corruption, political corruption, bureaucratic corruption has a very high level of salience. And let me get into an application section also. So I'm focusing on things that we don't normally think about, that we think is quite critical in fighting corruption, about which we have briefed Siabok as well. To motivate what I want to say here, and I'm going to be quick and somebody can signal to me how much time I have left, I want to just introduce two concepts or theories about corruption that are introduced in economic theory. One talks about corruption as in poor countries as greasing the wheel. What do they mean? So, 30 years ago when I had to go and get my driving license at RMV, the system was quite weak. You had to apply for your driving license. You had to wait, 2 weeks to get your license after that. But if you paid 300 rupees to the guy behind the counter, he got it to you in a day. Later, RMV made that official, right? So you could actually pay the state rather than that guy. But you would argue that what was happening was that other people's licenses still came in 2 weeks. The promised service standard was quite low. But the bureaucracy kind of developed a layer of efficiency on top. And for those who are willing to pay that little extra, they delivered the driving license faster. And this is what economists say, that there are lots of economic papers written on this. I myself have written on this for Transparency International all the way back in their report in 2008. That corruption can grease the wheels of the public sector. And so for a long time, you found for decades that economists took a more tolerant approach to corruption. They saw it as driving efficiency in the public sector for a fee, and this was a useful way to improve public sector where management reforms were not being undertaken. But starting in the 90s, lots of economic papers started seeing this differently. They said, actually, maybe corruption isn't greasing the wheels. Maybe it is putting sand in the wheels. Why did they say that? Because they noticed that actually the capacity or possibility for corruption is precisely what kept the public sector inefficient, with red tape and broken and dysfunctional in the first place. Public sector reform was very difficult when the opportunities for corruption existed. So you've seen some of our research and reports talking about this single window for customs, how you can digitize customs clearance. Enormous amounts of duplication, paperwork, wastage of time takes place. It hurts the economy enormously that the customs in Sri Lanka is not properly digitized. That's a battle that every government has fought with customs since the early 90s. After 25 years or 20 years, Verite actually entered that battle in 2016, and we had to do a lot of work to solve it. The final piece was that electronic signatures were not accepted by customs. But we had to take it to the Attorney General and kind of take a legal challenge on customs, finally to get them to accept electronic signatures, which was preventing all the digitizing platforms that people had spent billions of rupees on from working. Okay. What was happening there? The wheels of government were being sanded because, as you know, there's a great advantage to customs, and this is a popular perception as well, in keeping that system manual, in keeping that system untraceable, in forcing people to deal individually rather than electronically with customs. So really, sanding the wheels. And if you ask why Sri Lanka's public sector is so far behind and falling behind by the year, even with our regional peers, there might be a very interesting problem here. That actually creating that space for corruption, being complacent, thinking that corruption can grease the wheels, may have actually allowed corruption to sand the wheels of the public sector and keep it going. People are very concerned. When you ask people to talk about the top 10 most corrupt sectors, they pick the police, they pick parliament, they pick the public sector in a significant way. Unprompted, they pick the police the highest, and then you prompt them, they pick it again. And public sector corruption is salient in many ways. They talk about how it happens. So there's a great deal of worry and concern and understanding about how the public sector engages in corruption. Okay. And these are also how people's responses divide up over the types of corruption. And I just want to end with what is the response to this manifestation. So what we did was we detailed out manifestations of public sector being sanded, of malfunctioning, of being dysfunctional. And we think that CMB can really look at itself as unlocking these problems. So we have detailed analysis for CMB of how they can get into talking about processing delays, setting standards for asking public sector to give times for how long it will take to process something. When you can't, there's a lot of discretion at the public sector. More you create discretion, the more there's room for rent seeking on that discretion. With disruption and withdrawal of service, denying information delays, or not knowing how to even get information, withholding information. So the right to information bill was an extremely important step, if you think about it. Because, and why it's so resisted also, because denying information, not letting people know where to find information, is a classic way of rent seeking and allowing, forcing people, because people rationalize corruption or payments to overcome information deficiency, to overcome delays and inefficiency, to increase their convenience or reduce their cost, and to level the playing field when they see the system is unjust. So the more the system manifests information deficiency, inefficiency, increasing cost to the user, and injustice within the system, the more corruption becomes also tolerated, because people see no other way. They feel they have to make these payments, get their job done, and you have lots of experiences of those also. So let me stop there, and we can discuss more in question time about what is a way in which both development organizations and CMB can take public sector reform. That is actually setting standards that the public sector must meet. Customer satisfaction standards can be such an important way of responding to reducing corruption and also reducing the social tolerance for corruption, because people, when they have these problems, tend to rationalize corruption because they feel trapped when the system doesn't deliver and work. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jamil, for giving us those insights and a bit of understanding and background into what we can expect when we look at these reports. It's my pleasure now to switch over to Canada, like I said. My apologies in advance, again, just in case we have delays. I think we're running about 15 seconds delay at the moment. So I will hand over and invite Mercedes and Kate to take over from RiWi in Canada. They will be sharing their screen as well. So that's how we will get their presentation. And they should be on probably 10-15 seconds delay, but they'll be on in a second. Thanks.
All right, so as I mentioned, and I'm not sure what everybody has already heard, but I'll just start from the beginning again, just to cover all my bases. My name is Mercedes Fogarasi, and my colleague Kate Dyer is also here today. We're very thrilled to be here and happy to be invited, so thank you very much for including us in this event. And of course, we're very happy to be able to participate virtually because we're not located in Sri Lanka with you all. We're actually based in Toronto, Canada. So it's our morning and your evening, and I hope everybody is doing very well today. RiWi stands for Real-Time Interactive Worldwide Intelligence, and that's why we call ourselves RiWi, because quite frankly, it's a very long name to have there. And we do a lot of really interesting things using a technology that we invented originally about 10 years ago at the University of Toronto, mainly used for pandemic mapping and disease surveillance. So we really came from a public health background, but since then we've been able to use our technology for a variety of different humanitarian-focused issues, mainly in this space of global citizen engagement, international development, and global security as well. So today I'll speak to you a little bit about how our technology works, what it is really that we do, a little bit about why we're unique as well and maybe different from other methodologies that you may have come across before. And then Kate will go into a little bit about what the actual findings from this survey show and what they tell us about the situation of corruption in Sri Lanka today. So I mentioned that we are RiWi, and what it is exactly that we do is that we're committed to understanding very sensitive topics in hard to reach environments, but making sure that everybody is included in the story and making sure that even those people who are at the back of the room or more of those traditionally quiet voices, that they're included as well. The technology that we have ensures that even people who are usually not included in traditional research or those who might be excluded or ignored for any reason are able to have their voices heard, making sure that all voices are taken into account. This results in very accurate data, but also results in very rapidly available data as well because of the reach that we have. We really think about finding the truth in the noise amongst all of the data, and we're very aware that there's lots of data out there and that we are one small piece of the puzzle, but we provide a unique data feed and data stream into everything that's happening in our world today. In terms of how or what makes us unique and why it is we do what we do, the technology we have, as I mentioned, we're the only ones that own it or have control and use over it because we did invent it. It has the access to every country in the world, including traditionally closed societies, and it can't be blocked, censored, or monitored in any way. The data that we collect is collected quite rapidly, and we're also able to deploy our work quite rapidly as well. So within 24 to 48 hours of some event happening, whether it's a political event or an environmental event, we're able to go in field quite quickly to begin gathering the data as it happens and to do those rapid assessments. Similarly with that, all of the data that we capture also comes in quite rapidly and in real time as well. We collect thousands of surveys within weeks usually, and obviously that depends on the size of a country, but the data we capture is quite rapid, which can be quite helpful for a lot of this really interesting research. Really at the center of what we do is anonymity and security and safety for respondents. We're very aware of that because of the socially sensitive topics that we deal with. We work on a variety of topics from anti-corruption to human rights abuses, labor abuses, gender-based violence, LGBTQ rights, political participation, a number of very different and really interesting issues, but that can be very difficult to ask either face-to-face or in a situation where you might know who the respondent is and the respondent might know who you are. Not only does that introduce a significant amount of bias in terms of social desirability bias, but it also can really compromise the safety of the person on the other end, whether it is face-to-face or over a screen. All of the data that we capture is completely anonymous, and we don't collect any of that personal data or personally identifiable information either. I mentioned that the data we capture comes in real time, but it's also coming in on a continuous basis. So not only are we able to deploy quite quickly after something might be happening, but we can actually see how the data change in relation to real-time events, which is particularly interesting if there is something unpredictable that happens. It's nice to be able to have that real-time data feed ongoing. And then, as I mentioned, it's also particularly sensitive for these types of socially sensitive issues, or it's particularly effective for these types of socially sensitive issues for a variety of reasons, including the fact that all of our respondents are completely random as well as anonymous. So we're able to get that true read, accurate read on all of these types of very interesting issues. So I spoke a little bit about how or why it is that we do what we do and what makes us unique, but in terms of how it works, we are an internet-based methodology and an internet technology. And the way it works is when somebody is surfing around online completely unintentionally, they might happen upon an otherwise inactive domain, whether that's by mistyping in the URL box or whether that's by clicking on a link that might have been there yesterday but is no longer there today. That might take someone to an otherwise inactive domain. What our technology is able to do is A, identify those domains, and then B, put our content on those domains for any one given use of a survey. And we're able to determine the country and sometimes at a subnational level as well of the respondent to make sure that they get the appropriate survey or message test that we have running at that time in their appropriate language as well. When a user comes across these surveys, they're able to respond anonymously and safely, but they don't have to. They can leave if they would like as well. And so we offer that option to respondents. They're not incented in any way, which also limits the social desirability bias. But because they are completely anonymous and safe, we find that people are actually more inclined to answer the surveys on these types of socially sensitive topics. And then finally, all of the data is delivered through a real-time interactive dashboard, which is very easy to do different data cuts and different types of analysis. And I'll show a quick example of what that looks like in just a couple slides. So that's really how our technology works. And I don't want to take over this presentation with all of the technical aspects, but that's definitely something that we can take offline if there are more questions, which we're very aware that there are always lots of questions from the technical side, because this is a new technology that if you're not aware of and you haven't heard of before, can be very confusing at the beginning. And that's something that we're more than happy to chat about. So this is an example of how the survey actually looks on our platform. And one of the specific questions that we ask in this survey. And I won't get into the data and the findings of this because Kate will go into that in just a little bit, but this is really how it looks. And we try to keep questions simple and easy to answer, really recognizing that literacy is very much a spectrum, especially online. We can't assume that people have a base level of literacy. And so we want to keep it as simple and accessible as possible while still maintaining respect for the respondent's time. So keeping these questions short, and trying to really hook respondents and keep them on the survey, but also understanding that they might leave as well, and that's totally fine. This is an example of what our dashboard looks like and the survey specifically that we did with this project here. So as you can see, there's lots of different findings that come from the dashboard, very easy to make different data cuts. And again, I won't touch on these findings specifically, but Kate will speak a little bit more to them in just a little bit, but this is a quick snapshot of what you would see when the data is actually coming in. So pretty interesting. And I personally really enjoy checking our dashboards all the time just to see how things are changing. All right, so I will hand it over to my colleague Kate now, who will take over and chat a little bit more about what exactly it is that we did with this specific project.
Great, thanks so much, Mercedes. Yeah, so just to give you guys some background information on this project specifically, we were engaged by East West Management Institute back in March to conduct an online perception survey. The purpose of the study obviously was to collect public perceptions on corruption and bribery in Sri Lanka. So together with East West Management Institute, we developed the questions for the survey, and we were actually able to take some of the questions from the Verite report and adapt them onto our platform. So the final survey consisted of 14 questions, but each respondent was led down a unique path through sophisticated skip logic, depending on whether or not they had ever experienced corruption. We launched the survey on March 11th, and it stayed in field for about 3 weeks, and we completed data collection on March 30th. So if you could go to the next slide, Mercedes. So the survey was offered in both Sinhala and Tamil, although the majority of respondents did choose Sinhala as their preferred language. All the respondents at the beginning of the survey were asked to complete and identify their age and gender as a key demographic question. Because the target audience of this survey was the internet using population, our gender and age breakdowns do tend to differ from the national population. So to make it representative, we do take the data collected in this age and gender question, and we apply weights to the rest of the data sample to make it representative of the national population. Our sample, obviously, without the weights, do tend to be more male and tend to skew to the younger age brackets. So over 8,500 people ended up being exposed and opted into our survey. That means that they answered at least the age and gender question. That being said, in the 3-week period, 2,721 respondents completed the entire survey. So we did get quite a large sample in a very short period of time. Of this sample, 48% were male and 52% were female. And over 58% of the sample was under the age of 45. In terms of which regions our respondents came from, the majority came from the Western region and then followed by the Central. Those two regions ended up making up 50% of our sample. Next slide, Mercedes. So to begin the survey, respondents were asked a variety of questions to gauge their attitudes and perceptions on various types of corruption that we see in Sri Lanka. This was done by randomly exposing the respondent to 2 out of these 5 scenarios. Each scenario was followed up by 3 questions in which we tried to gauge whether or not the respondent had encountered or know someone that has encountered one of these scenarios, what the level of acceptability is within Sri Lankan society, and how common they believe it is. Across all scenarios, most of the respondents said that they had never encountered it, which is great. This being said, out of the 5, the most encountered scenario was that perpetrated by a government official, followed by a member of parliament who forgoes the proper hiring process. In terms of how common these activities are, the data shows that the corruption undertaken by a traffic police officer is seen as the most common. Again, this was followed by a member of parliament who forgoes the proper hiring process. Lastly, with the level of acceptability, by far the most unacceptable corruption scenario was that undertaken by a school principal. And then this was also followed up by a member of parliament. So we can see throughout these 3 questions that a member of parliament definitely struck a chord with our respondents. So once the respondents had finished following up those 6 kind of questions that were scenario based, we then kind of wanted to dive into their unique experiences and encounters with corruption. So Mercedes, if you just go to the next slide. So here we asked the respondents, have you, a relative or a close friend, ever experienced or witnessed corruption? So as you can see, 70% of the respondents said that they had never experienced corruption. 13% said that they have, and 17% said they're not sure, which shows that people may not know how to define corruption and therefore maybe don't know how to identify it. So when cut by language, this actually was a super interesting finding that Tamil speakers actually were more likely to have experienced corruption. They were at 26% compared to Sinhala speakers, which only reported about 9%. Tamil speakers in the same breath also were more likely to not know whether they had experienced corruption, which shows maybe a lack of awareness or understanding there. So we can go to the next slide, Mercedes, please. So from here, we asked the respondents who had experienced corruption whether or not they had reported it. So 44% of the people that had experienced it reported the incident. That being said, 29% of those people report suffering negative consequences from reporting it, and 17% said nothing came of their report. In terms of where they reported these incidents, 30% said that they reported it to the police. Another 30 said friends or family, and Siabak was just under that with 20%. The rest of the findings were split between other or media institutions, which were fairly low. Out of the 56% of people that did not report the incident of corruption that they experienced, 35 also said that they did not report it because they were afraid of negative consequences. An additional 24% said that they didn't report it because they thought nothing would come of it. So we're seeing kind of a trend in these 2 consequences there. Out of the 70% of people who have not experienced corruption, 60% said they would report it. So this is kind of showing a discrepancy between when you actually experience it, what is kind of holding you back in that sense, because we're seeing a much lower rate of reports. Here, people said 60% said that they would report it to the police, and only 13% said that they would report it to CMB or friends and family. Here we see 11% said that they would not report it at all, which shows that people that have not experienced it definitely have more interest in reporting it if they were to experience it. So it definitely takes some further investigation to understand that what is that barrier once they have experienced it. The next slide, please. So in conclusion, the corrupt scenarios involving the member of parliament was one of the most encountered, seen as one of the most common, and also as one of the most unacceptable. So this kind of mirrors Verite's report in the sense that respondents are really seeing that political corruption really hits home to them, it hits a chord. So that's definitely something worth investigating further. Another interesting finding was that the police officer, the traffic police officer, was one of the most common, but also one of the most accepted scenarios. So this is showing some kind of normalization within society, and the fact that people are still willing to go to police to report these scenarios shows some kind of discrepancy there, which would definitely be of interest. Furthermore, we obviously see that there's a lot of barriers to people reporting these incidences and consequences that shouldn't stand and therefore are limiting people to continue reporting them. So definitely something more to look into of how we can break down those challenges within society. So that's it for now, but we are definitely open to taking some more questions during this Q&A period.
Thank you very much. From this end, before Kate and Mercedes log off the line, because we do have to log them off to get back onto a different platform. Do we have any questions for Kate or Mercedes from the audience? We'll be happy to share a microphone if there are any questions. Just a moment.
Hi, this is Javira. Now I have a question in the survey. What segment of the population was analyzed? Because the survey, I feel, is from the lower end of the population. If you go to the real business people who are involved in import, export, they will not care about the police and things like that, but there is state solicitation, which is the prime importance in, say, ease of doing business.
Mr. Jayavira, may I just clarify, is your question for the RiWi survey particularly, or in general for both the Verite? Right. It's so then may I hand that question over to... Sure. Mercedes and Kate, if you'd like to take that. A question regarding the sampling, on what sample of the population the survey targeted.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
So the question was, when you look at, for instance, in the scenario of ease of business, whether the population surveyed or the sample of the survey was what level, or whether it was businessmen and industrial, that sector, or whether it was general population, rather than those involved in business, those involved in import and export, where the ease of business would be something that is of importance in considering corruption and bribery.
Yeah, so our sample was just the general population of the internet using population. So we definitely could have asked a question that would have identified business owners or business people within society, and that definitely would have been a super interesting crosscut. But for the survey, we just did general population and didn't identify those subsectors.
Thank you very much. Any more questions from the audience for Kate or Mercedes? Right. So then we will say thank you very much, Kate and Mercedes, to both of you. And we'll connect with you a little later on. But I will prepare to take the rest of the questions that we have for, obviously, Dr. Dimel and the Verite team, as well as possibly for Indika. Thank you, and see you guys on the other side. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'll start by answering Tissa's question. I think Tissa is both, you're right that there wouldn't have been a lot of exporters and business people simply because what we are doing is a representative sample of the population. So in any representative sample of the population, you tend to get the balance. So there are a lot more people who are not businessmen and entrepreneurs in the population than there are businessmen and entrepreneurs. So that's what the sample is going to represent. So we have a very effective randomized collection of a total population representative sample, because the methodology we use to stratify the sample and randomize it at a GN level. There are 14,400 GN divisions in the country, and we try to take it to as many as possible by limiting it to 10 people that will sample from any GN division, and also distributing our selection of GN divisions in a randomized way, but based on district populations. So there's a whole process around that. Vanguard Survey are the architects of that kind of design, and they do a really good job on that. So that's how we proceed. And so what we are really trying to tap into is the overall social consensus or view on that. So in any certain pockets, the view will always be different. So thanks for the question. Any other question that I can take? I'm sure there aren't any, and we can all go, but Asoka had to ask a question.
Yeah, thank you both for the presentations. I think my question, well, it's a very brief comment and a question. One thing that we have also realized is that even the vulnerability to corruption also can differ quite significantly. I mean, some work that we've done sort of had also illustrated, let's say, within the estate sector, the vulnerability to corruption may skew quite significantly. And I wonder, and this leads to my question, which is around the entire anti-corruption setup. In light of the fact that CMB is an entity which has its main setup in Colombo, did anything in your data, and I'm not sure if you can answer this question or not, but did anything in your data give you any sense of whether the further you were away from the CMB head office in Colombo, the further away you felt from the actual anti-corruption system and filing complaints and things of that nature?
So I can answer that question straight up. Sachi might find you the, so we do cover that. Precise question, how we did that was, we actually asked people, well, how do you like to report corruption? What is your preferred method? And we found that reporting in person was highly favored over other methods of reporting corruption. So people didn't like to, write letters. That's kind of a very tedious, difficult thing to do. They didn't necessarily want a hotline. They wanted to appear in person. They felt safer. And that was the preferred way. So when CMB is in, and that's one of our pieces of advice to CMB that we offered, that people much prefer being able to walk in, see a person and confide in that and feel safe doing that. Because also people think the police are vindictive when you report corruption, and they think that the CMB works with the normal police force that they're afraid of. So there's a lot of concerns that arise for CMB because people find the police as a very, very threatening element when they are reporting corruption, and they experience a lot of corruption by the police. So there are various factors, including what you're saying, that people prefer to turn up in person. So one of our recommendations is that CMB thinks of mobile units that are publicized and turn up in different places to gather reports of corruption. You take the Sri Lanka Press Council, or that has a reporting structure, but they collect about 200 complaints on the press and the media every year. Whereas you can walk out into the streets and collect 200 a day, right? So really you need to have an architecture that encourages reporting of corruption, not just saying you have a method to report, here it is, but to see the elicitation of reporting as part of the mandate of a corruption agency like that. So I think so Asoka, of course, is the head of Transparency International and has done a great deal in this area, and thanks for pointing out that. Yeah, I'm sorry I can't figure out the page right now, but we have a detailed analysis on that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dimel, for that. Any other questions from the audience? We did have a couple of questions on Zoom, but it seems that in the course of the presentation they were answered. So may I?
Question,
yes, to you.
Hi, Doctor. My name is Shane Godwin. My question to you is, did the study look at specifically the lack of enforcement and the public perception of lack of enforcement, especially in terms of comparison between petty and grand sort of corruption?
Yes. So again, so we have an 8-point lecture for CBOC, and you guys are making me revisit that in different ways. So we really looked at the confidence, like the perceived benefits of reporting to CBOC, and the perceived, cost or risk of reporting to CBOC. So in the perceived benefit, 28% said they didn't report to CBOC in instances of corruption. And often that was connected to people thinking that very little happened when they reported corruption. So there this sense that, so one of our engagements, CBOC, is that, if you have to not only address corruption or prosecute, but there has to be a lot of attention and communication around actions to prosecute corruption. Your work must seem larger than it is if people are to feel that it is worth actually taking the trouble to report. Taking the trouble to report corruption is costly. I mean, it can be risky on one side because if the person that you reported against finds out, they can take action against you. And many people reported how when they made a complaint about corruption, how the police especially, or public officials actually engaged in vengeful behavior against them. And some very nasty stories emerged in our focus groups on, and they prefer to be safe. And especially if they think that actually not much will come out of the reporting. So that came out very clearly, that people felt that it wasn't efficacious, adequately efficacious, and it was also risky. So when you have a high cost and a low benefit, it can become quite difficult to encourage people to take action against corruption. And then they look to survive. And see themselves as having no choice but to actually facilitate that corruption and continue. And those were the narratives that emerged in our study. And they were some of the narratives were really quite shocking. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions? Dr. Dimel, thank you. I think seems like no more questions from the audience, and everything that had been asked on Zoom was answered in the process of the presentations. So we're
Thank you very much for inviting us and for all that you have come here. And I think it's extra step to turn up in times of COVID. There's increased cost, and you might wonder whether there was reduced benefit. But I hope you found it useful. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So from my end, let me just end by saying thank you once again to each and every one of you for your presence here, as well as to all of those joining us online via Zoom and on Facebook as well. From the EWMI team, which is, of course, Indika here in Colombo, but we have Mark in Washington and Manali also joining us from across the big pond. Thank you to them for putting this together and for everything involved in this research project. Of course, to Kate and Mercedes over in Toronto right now, and from myself and the team at AmCham, thank you. Stay safe and do keep yourselves blessed and protected. We have some refreshments laid out. Please do join us for that and a little bit of fellowship before you leave. Of course, bearing in mind the physical distancing rules. Thank you once again, and have a wonderful and blessed evening and a weekend ahead.